Dear class, I feel I should perhaps grasp the nettle of our topic, Franz Kafka and his part in the emergence of the modern, the title of our class. Grasp it a little more firmly than I did in my previous faintly dreamy, by which I mean dreamlike, video. And Deo Volente, I should really say technology permitting, as opposed to Deo Volente, God willing, inshallah, in the old invocation. Technology permitting, bring you another, slightly firmer meditation on the same subject. So I was thinking of calling it Kafka Laughs, and it may be that once you've taken a look at his work, you may decide a better title would have been Kafka, Not Many Laughs. But what I mean by Kafka Laughs is not the presence of laughs in Kafka. There's a good Kafka laugh in this one. But rather the fact that Kafka himself laughed, and in that sense still laughs, in the immortal world of art, of literature. He laughed at his own stories when he read them aloud to his friends, as he did. Not much published in his lifetime, but his friends were rewarded with stories by one of the greatest writers of all time. He's one of the most celebrated ones at this point in history. And what they thought about his stories, as far as I know, history does not relate, whether they laughed with the author, and if they did so, whether that was because they actually found it funny in the same way that he did, or because he read them very amusingly, perhaps, or because they thought it was polite to laugh. Anyway, we don't know, and we don't really care, because what fascinates us is the account of Kafka himself laughing loudly and often at his own work. I think many authors do. I'm ashamed to say that I'm terribly amused by the things I put on the page, which is awful, really. One should be much more modest than that, and it's certainly no guarantee that anyone else should find them funny. It's simply more remarkable that Kafka did, because we treat his works as terrible, sinister echoes from the beyond, sinister expressions of the horror of living under totalitarianism, whichever totalitarianism it is that you might be living under, and therefore recognize in Kafka's stories the sense of doom that inhabits them, and of course, above all, the disparity, as I sought to stress in my previous email, between our idea, conventional idea, the classical idea, the normative idea of the normality of daily existence, of its ordinariness, in whatever that consists, is undermined, set aside, overshadowed by the world of modernism, not only of Kafka's modernism, but everyone else's. That's to say, towards the end of the 19th century, we began to lose our nerve as a species, whether because we'd just come through the age of empire, which really ought to be enough to make any culture, Western culture in this case, lose its nerve, but whether we felt a frisson of the impending horror of the First World War, which certainly confused us at a deep psychic level, obliging us to reconsider whether the stories we told, as we'd been telling them for, you might say, thousands of years, were really adequate to what crawled out from under the stone of civilization and needed to be acknowledged. We couldn't go on saying, well, we're jolly nice people and we do our best to be good, and there's a few bad apples, but basically we're trying to find a nice partner in life and a comfortable situation, and continue pleasantly along with our family and friends. Well, that had been so firmly interrupted by the First World War, in which case, which fractured family and friends, with the loss of life under the most appalling circumstances, in which we were really all complicit. We failed to halt that war. We failed to foresee and avoid that war. We went along with it. We tottered over the trenches into the mud, along with every group of poor young men from either side who plodded off to their death in the horror of the mud. So we had to acknowledge that there was a creature lurking under our comfortable veneer. I think Harold Pinter, a great modern contemporary playwright, called it the weasel under the drinks cabinet. As it were, there's something in our comfortable homes, the homes that decorated storytelling for so many generations. It didn't account for the weasel that we now know to be in there under the drinks cabinet. So this weasel, as I tried to describe in my previous video, the weasel shows up in music in the form of atonal music, which suddenly an aural and atonal weasel disturbs the happy drinks cabinet of the old octave-based music, and in painting, where cubism, among other developments, disrupts the broadly speaking, photographic rendering of the real, with something which seems not to be visible anywhere, and yet we look at a Picasso face or a cubist body descending a staircase, and we see what is happening. We see that there's a face there, even though it doesn't correspond to what we've been taught to see as a face and what we think we see as a face when we look at each other. But do we? What do we really see? And that question, asked and answered by artists in all modes of art, was certainly asked by Kafka in a way that has resonated now for quite a few generations. So we have to consider why he found it funny and whether we should find it funny. The stories I've given you to read, the Country Doctor is the least serene of the stories, because in many ways much of what Kafka describes derives its force from the literalness with which he writes it, almost as though it were a conventional story, except that what's happening is not conventional at all, any more than it is conventional in A Country Doctor that the horses he can't find in order to go and visit his sick patient emerge from the pigsty, as opposed to from a stable. And many other foreshadowings in that story that things are not quite right with the world. And the whole of The Hunter Gracchus is not quite right, because it describes a man who is neither alive nor dead. And in a hunger artist, we get a display of something which we are reluctant to believe would really be available for people to enjoy, somebody in a cage starving. We often put writers in cages, or they take up residence in a store window for people to come and watch them write. It's an interesting parallel to a hunger artist. And Kafka's most famous story is also extremely literal at the same time as being extremely alarming. It's called The Metamorphosis. In German, it's Die Verwandlung. And Wandlung means a change, and in German you attach a variety of little prefixes to words to reroute their meaning. Verwandlung means a complete, an utter and total change. Zerwandlung, which isn't a word but could be one, would mean a change, a disastrous change. And right now there's a new exhibition on in the German Museum in Berlin, an exhibition, a permanent exhibition of photographs by a celebrated photographer, a friend of mine who, in fact, has included me naked in the exhibition. So if you're Jewish or not Jewish, or think of going to Berlin, think of going to the Jewish Museum there, avert your eyes when you get to see your stark naked old professor, and you might think, oh my God. But the exhibition has a strange title as well. It might have. It's called Zerheilt. Heilt means healed, same word. And sehr, the same word I offered you in an imaginary word, Zerwandlung, a disastrous turn. Zerhalt means healed to destruction. Extraordinary word, but you can invent such words. That's the nature of German, of what I think of as the enormous spanner set of German nouns and verbs and adjectives and their prefixes. So there is a Kafka with his extraordinary story of a man who finds himself to be a bug in the morning and so can't go to work and is abused and has things thrown at him in his room and eventually dies, and that's the story. But it's told very straightforwardly, invoking for us, I think, our inner bug, the sense in which when we look in the mirror we see something all too human, all too plausibly human, when we know ourselves to be, in all kinds of ways, invisible ways, to be a cockroach. Also, of course, the abuse piled on the poor bug. It is as if his family, or the world rather, has woken up one morning to find that they are harboring a Jew in their midst who really must be killed. It's notorious that the Nazis viewed the people they were exterminating as vermin, including particularly the Jews as vermin. And here's a story of going to bed a man and waking up a vermin. And this is what happened to Jews under the sway of the Nazis. And Kafka himself, this was a proleptic vision. He didn't live to see it, although there was plenty of persecution of Jews already, but there was no... it required some foresight to anticipate extermination in the way that the Nazis decided they must proceed with. And he, in a sense, fortunately one might say, died before he could be sent, as his mother and sisters were, to the death camps. So that's a famous story, but it's told in a very literal way, which could be funny if you were able to read it aloud as Kafka did, or had a kind of mind, as I suggested in my previous video, of an estranged nature, an estranged mind that maybe all of us in this class have in some measure. We don't really feel entirely in the swim of humanity and society. We feel slightly set to one side. As I suggested in my other video, language itself is set aside from reality. The word table isn't a table. It's a word. So there are parallel universes that we inhabit, and we may feel the need to create one or to live in one or enjoy one of our own, which is the world of art, in which strangeness, which seems to suggest things without actually stating them outright, comes nearest to our experience of reality, our experience of things looming out of a fog, a world that is a fog. That's always been there in literature in some measure. Ghost stories are as old as storytelling itself, and horror stories of various kinds, and they are the precursors of the modern, because it is precisely that sense of strange, unresolved, mysterious doom that we enjoy, assuming we do, in ghost stories. It's not at all like enjoying violence, for instance, in stories. It's a very different thing. In ghost stories, it's violence that never quite materializes, as though those of us who had lived through the First World War or the Second World War or any war know that we are on the verge of a terrible revelation, and that sensation of anticipating it, of its omnipresence, and yet refusing to come out like the weasel under the drinks cabinet. It's under there. Will it emerge and bite us in the ankle? That's our sensation of the modern, a sensation of fear and confusion, of puzzlement, hidden by behavior that allows us to make claim to normality. So it is. Bye-bye, dear class.